Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill, Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Chris Blattman, who is an economist and political scientist at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
You have, thanks for doing this, Chris. You have done a lot of work in the area of crime and violence, how to think about it, both from a policy perspective, but also understanding more about it from an experimental perspective. And I have to say, you are the only guy I know who have traveled to more dangerous places than south side of Chicago.
The funny thing is, a lot of these. I actually don't go anywhere truly dangerous. I wouldn't work in Pakistan and like tribal territories or Afghanistan or Iraq or. It's funny. Yeah, south side of Chicago is not a bad analogy for Liberia or northern Uganda or places like this. They're sort of none of them are very dangerous, to be fair.
Yeah. So it's very analogous. And so you have a paper in 2017 entitled "Reducing Crime and Violence: Experimental Evidence from Cognitive Behavioral Therapy in Liberia." And you say we show that a number of non-cognitive skills and preferences, including patience and identity, are malleable in adults, and that investments in them reduce crime and violence. So that makes a lot of intuitive sense, at least on the surface. So what do you mean by non-cognitive skills more broadly?
Well, that's an unfortunate phrase that economists have sort of centered on, and so when I'm writing a technical article, I throw that term in. But every skill is a cognitive skill in some sense. What as you or your listeners might know, generally people are sort of using that as a catch-all for soft skills or other skills, and it can include everything from our abilities to sort of exert self-control to something as wildly different as sort of our tastes for being a good person, or our tastes for identifying as a mainstream member of society. And the idea is that all of these aspects of our tastes and our identity and even our self-control is actually something that is under our control. And that and I think something that like cognitive behavior therapy has shown in just a huge range of aspects of human life, is really effective at sort of changing problematic thoughts that lead to problematic behaviors. And so that's just something I knew very little about, and I just stumbled upon in Liberia, this little innovative program. And that's kind of a big part of a lot of what my work stemmed from. I just go to these places, I look for people who have what seem like maybe kooky ideas or things that have no business working the way I think I understand the world, but then everything points to them working.
Yeah.
And I try to work with them to figure it out, what's going on, and scale it up and test it.
Yeah. So So you mentioned patience here. So if I abstract this just a little bit, Chris, so is it these skills that are sort of be considered to be autonomous, but so sort of personality, behavior, but as you say, they could all be controlled, they could all be managed, and perhaps training could have an effect. And so you have an experimental study in Liberia, right? Which is a very interesting study. And there are four cohorts of people there. Do you want to talk a bit about sort of the design of the study?
Sure. So, I mean, maybe stepping back, what happened is I was in Liberia looking for various programs, mostly working outside the capital, when I came to realize that probably to the extent the country was going to grow and stable again, it wasn't going to be from these sort of former rebels and potential mercenaries who are off in the gold and diamond mines, which is where I'd been working, and I'd done some other studies and work. I realized that probably they were going to emerge in the capital part because they were close to the action. It was really easy to mobilize them, and not just into the next war. Maybe a war which nearly broke out several times in neighboring Cote d'Ivoire would marshal them, or maybe there'd be election violence, especially around the elections involving President George Weah and so forth. So that seemed like the place for instability. And so I called somebody I knew to show me around, a guy named Johnson Bohr, who could go just about anywhere. And I wanted to understand sort of the fabric of life for these young men. And so we went to he could take me to a drug den run by the former government head of the anti-terror squad under a previous regime, or he could take me to the mobile phone fencers, or he could take me to the pickpockets, because he knew them. He had relationships with a lot of them, being sort of an outreach and social worker. And we'd just talk to them. And every time we do that, we'd leave a drug den or something, and somebody would come up to me, and come up to him rather, as we're leaving, maybe shining shoes across the street or selling shoes out of a wheelbarrow or something. And he'd greet Johnson very excitedly, and they'd catch up, and I'd say, well, how do you guys know one another? And the first time the guy pointed to the drug den, and he said, well, I used to be like those guys, and then I went to Johnson's program, and now now I changed my life. And I was like, oh, and then that happened the next day, and it happened the day after that. We'd keep meeting these young men, say, oh, I used to be like that pickpocket, and then Johnson really helped me turn my life around. And so I said to Johnson, like, what is this? Tell me again about this program. And he talks about like personal transformation and all of this. It didn't make any sense to me. And so I actually had him write it down. I was like, okay, let's go. We sat in front of a computer for a few days in a bar, and we just wrote down activity by activity, day by day, what they do.
Yeah.
And my wife's a psychologist, and we actually do a lot of our work together. She was off in the gold and diamond mines I mentioned, helping run one of our other projects while I was doing this. And when she comes back, I showed this to her, and I said, do you remember that guy Johnson? And what does this look like to you? And she says, oh, this looks like cognitive behavior therapy. Like, I haven't seen it quite like this before. But this seems like has echoes of some stuff we do in the US. It's just applied to different things. It's applied to being less aggressive and being less criminal and being more of adopting a mainstream identity rather than being a renegade or an outcast. So that's a good sort of description. They basically spend 8 or 10 weeks in small groups, led by one of the people Johnson's trained, sometimes Johnson, facilitating, basically trying to recognize what their really problematic behaviors are to do with aggression and this identity and this lifestyle they've chosen, and then practicing small ways to sort of think differently or act differently in circumstances. Basically practicing faking being a different kind of person until it becomes second nature, which is something we all do and all have done in our lives.
So this is the sort of, I don't know if it's the right term, as Chris, but troubled young people, right?
Yeah. Well, we tried doing the most trouble. I mean, these guys weren't just troubled. These guys were like professional stick-up artists or potential mercenaries. And we were sort of deliberately went searching for the people we thought would be the most likely to engage in political violence if it broke out.
Okay. And so just to get an idea, Liberia, what is the sort of the demographics? What's the population of Liberia?
Right. It's a tiny country. A lot of people might struggle to think about where it is on a map. It's a former American colony in a sense. It's where blacks from free blacks, mostly freeborn blacks, returned in the early middle 19th century from places like Maryland and Virginia and whatnot to Africa. And it was the place where the Americans assisted them in settling. And then, of course, there's a huge indigenous population that's intermingled. But it's tiny. It's on the coast of West Africa. It's right beside Cote d'Ivoire. It's maybe just 4 million people. If the roads are any good, you could drive across it in a day. The roads are not very good, so it takes days to get across it. But it's this little country on the coast. It's tropical. It's apparently, I think it's the wettest country in the world because it's basically just a lot of tropical rainforest and swamp hugging the coast. And it's pretty young, like a lot of countries in that region. And it's pretty poor. Like when people rank countries on the Human Development Index, it's about 1 or 2 notches below Afghanistan. So it's not in a good place.
Yeah. And so per capita income in the hundreds?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't probably. I mean, the way to think about it is like the average person has a roof over their heads. It's not a particularly nice roof. They can eat 3 meals a day of relatively limited, variety. So it's not it's not starvation or anything, but it's a high levels of underemployment. People basically living on a couple dollars a day at the median is. But I don't actually have the recent statistics at my fingertips. They didn't really have the data back then. When I was there, they'd had just recovered from 15 years of political instability and war. So, it's a guessing game as to how much, it's just a made up number, the GDP anyways.
Right. So cognitive behavior therapy, CBT. So this is basically sort of a therapist providing guidance. So some sort of a program that they go through. What exactly happens in CBT?
Right. Well, so a lot of people are probably familiar with it, even if they don't realize it. I mean, it infects a lot of what we do from kindergarten to everyday therapy. Like if your listener had an anxiety disorder or depression or post-traumatic stress, or I'm actually using an app right now called Noom, which is sort of basically healthy eating habits. And it's all CBT based. It's very explicit about that. All CBT is. It's basically saying, listen, you're doing this as a problem. You're either getting anxious and not able to sleep, or you're eating too many calories. And basically there are some simple habits that if you learn to sort of recognize the urges and think about them differently, then you're going to be able to change your behavior. And you're just going to, for the next 12 or 15 or 20 weeks, practice these little things, take these baby steps, try to become really conscious of the thing that's driving this problematic behavior, these automatic thoughts and these sorts of reactions that you're having. And you're going to train yourself to recognize them and act differently. And it works pretty well. There's tons of evidence for a lot of these disorders, not disorders, problematic behaviors, that it's helpful. It's not helpful for everything. I think it doesn't work that well for drug addiction, for example. And this was just applied to a different kind of problematic behavior, which is that these guys are getting into fights on the street and they are robbing people and they are tempted to join a conflict, and they sort of recognize that this is, the key is they're not very happy in the state of life. If there was some counterculture that really celebrated their outcast status, then maybe they'd think this is great, especially if they made a lot of money at it. But they don't. There's a really bad life, and they know it. And they just don't realize that anything else is possible. And Johnson comes along, he says, listen, actually, a lot of things you're doing are just bad thinking and bad habits. And I'm going to help you recognize that and practice some habits that help you basically be a normal person. And you don't believe me, but you're going to fake it for a while, and then you're going to realize you can get away with it, and that you can fool yourself, you can fool other people, and we're all just fooling each other. into thinking we're like normal, and I just need to sort of like give you the way, and that's basically it. And yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like this is a good thing, right, Chris? So you set out to actually test this in a randomized trial,
right? So it seemed like plausible, and I was happy that there was lots of like whether or not it lasts, whether or not there's big effects, whether or not it can really help guys who are as badly off as these guys are really close to the edge of everything. They're close to the edge of extreme violence. They're close to the edge of extreme poverty. It wasn't clear that this could actually help them, especially since they were so far gone, it seemed. And so we ended up scaling it up, and so over several cohorts, because it just took a long time to raise the money. It was super complex, and just the capacity to run this program was hard. But over the course of a couple of years, we identified 1,000 of these really high-risk young men, and half got the CBT, half did not, in groups of about 20. And then we also cross-hatched a different intervention, which is where we just gave them a cash grant of $200. So some people ended up getting the grant, some people ended up getting CBT only, some people got both, some people got neither. And the reason for the grant was because we wanted to think about this was the clear constraint. Every time you said, like, what's stopping you from being like that guy over there shining shoes? And they'd say, well, I just don't, where am I going to get that? That whole setup costs whatever, maybe it costs $75. He's also dressed nicely. He's got a haircut. He has a place to sleep at night. Like, I just need a little money to make money. And so basically they were saying, I'm credit constrained. No one will lend me money. I don't have the money. I have nowhere to save it. And if I could get there, then I'd get off on this I'd be in this different equilibrium. I'd be okay. And which is plausible. And of course, there's a chance that they would interact and mutually reinforce one another. So we ran this big trial with both interventions over the course, and then we followed them up a couple months after the program and grant, and we followed them up a year and a bit later, and we're actually in the field right now, following them up after 10 years.
Oh wow! Okay, and so in the very tactical sense, what did you find? So there are 4 cohorts of people here. So those who received CBT and $200.
Right. So the short answer, short answer is the guys so everybody who got the CBT turned their life around in the short run. So within a couple months, we saw a big drop, like maybe 50% reductions in crime and violence. And it was evident also, like, they were dressing differently, they were talking differently, they were just thinking about themselves differently. And the same was true in the first couple months with the people who got the cash grant. So they had also been able to start something. They started selling goods on the side of the road in the market or something very basic. And they weren't making a lot of money, but they were doing a bit better. And so everybody was ahead of the control group that got neither. And then after a year, though, basically everyone had I want to say, so first of all, people had reverted in the sense that it's not that they'd fallen back all the way, because we caught them at their lowest point. So a lot of the people in the control group are also doing better over time, right? Because we're just catching people by construction at their lowest point. But after a year, the people who only got the cash or only got the therapy don't look that different from the control group who got neither. The CBT people are a little bit better off, a little less violent, but it seems to have receded. Whereas the group that got both still has sustained these really large reductions in crime and violence and big changes in behavior. They're not making any more money. It turns out everybody keeps getting robbed, or the police confiscate their goods, or weather or something destroys. So if there's no secure property rights, then guess what? You can't accumulate capital, and it's hard to make money. So everybody's poor again after a year. But the guys who got the CBT and the therapy have really drastically changed their life. Like, basically half of them have maybe stuck with this way of life, but half of them have changed and sustained a different kind of life. And we don't know for sure. We think what's happened is the CBT is so practice-based, right? It's learning by doing. Yeah. And we think what the grant did is after you did the CBT, it just sort of helped you keep practicing that different life for a bit longer, for maybe a few months longer. And then, within 6 months, the money's gone because of the flood or the police confiscation or you're robbed. But you had that 6 months where you were getting up every morning and pretending to be a normal guy with a normal business, and a 6 months where you didn't have to think about going back to robbery or muggings to sort of just eat your next meal. And so it just sort of had this buffer zone, if you will, that helped you solidify this new life.
Yeah,
and whether it sticks, we'll see. I don't know what to expect long run.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, Chris. So if I understand this correctly, both CBT and the grant and the money had beneficial effects in the very short run. Maybe the money a little bit higher than CBT.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have both of them, it seems to have reinforcing effect that continues longer. And so this has some policy implications, right? So, it seems to me without those initial conditions set, if I understand this correctly, Chris, it's very difficult to sustain the behavioral change that they may have acquired. But with capital constraints continuing as before, they just revert back very, very quickly.
Yeah. So my understanding, first of all, there's not a lot of long-term studies of CBT in general, even when it's anxiety or phobias or the normal things it's applied to. But my sense is that people think that CBT should be effective long-term for a lot of things. It's often more effective or more sustained when people have booster sessions or other things to reinforce them along the way. So, but there's a sense that it might fade away a bit over time, but that you can boost it over time. So the cash was like a big booster in some ways. Yeah. So it might have been, had we done this differently, that with booster sessions and some additional support, the CBT could have been more lasting. That's a totally reasonable hypothesis. It might be that this fades faster than some kinds of CBT treatments because these guys, if I have like a spider phobia and you help me get over my spider phobia through CBT, then it's not like the spider fear is like exerting this gravitational pull back to being fearful of spiders. And I'm just going to turn a corner one day and I'm going to get attacked by 40 spiders. And that's just going to reignite my fear. Like that just doesn't happen. Right. So it's not surprising that like a spider phobia is a pretty, that's a pretty permanent fix. But their lifestyle, all of their friends, a lot of their social network are still in that life. When they inevitably have a bad few weeks and they're hungry, that old life bears, sort of calls and is an option. And so I think there is this more of a gravitational pull. So it's not surprising to me that this is more aggressive over time. It was funny, at the exact same time, we didn't know about it, but at the exact same time, some people who are now close friends and colleagues, but I didn't know them at all then, were running a very similar experiment in Chicago high schools with the CBT program, not without the economic aspect. So it was just the one treatment. And they found very similar results, like really big short-term results, but a year or two later, the students were sort of back to normal levels of delinquent behavior. So now it turned them off during a really high delinquency period of their life. So that's great. So it's super, super effective, cost effective, but again, it was sort of temporary. So maybe there's this gravitational pull.
Yeah, I wondered if there is some sort of an environmental effect, Chris. I mean, it's difficult to test because, it'll be a much bigger experiment. What I mean by environmental effect is, if your friends are all in the program, then you can measure something. But if some of your friends are and some of your friends are not, then the gravitational pull that you talk about is probably a lot higher, right?
Yeah, there are probably these network effects. Absolutely. I have a student who started. She started as a student of these people who ran the Chicago study, and then when I arrived in Chicago, she adopted me as part of her committee, and she'd already been working on something where she was looking at the effects on siblings of getting treated, or also just of whether or not you get treated, how that affects your sibling. because these CBT programs are increasingly common in U.S. public schools. And so, and what she's found is things that are supportive of that. Nothing's concrete, but she's finding things that point in that direction. So I agree that would probably, and we anticipated that would be true. But if we designed the study in that way, in like randomized groups, we never would have had we never would have been able to get any precise estimates. So we had to sort of do this much more individualistic approach, which is the normal CBT thing to do. But I think you're right.
Yeah. I want to go into one of your recent papers, which is more looking at the economic aspect of it. So the long-term impacts of grants on poverty, 9-year evidence from Uganda's Youth Opportunities Program. So this is in 2008, Uganda gave $400 per person to thousands of young people to help them start skilled trades, work more, and raise incomes. You say your observation, 4 years on, an experimental evaluation found grants raised work by 17% and earnings by 38%. But again, disappointingly, after 9 years, we find these gains have dissipated. There's a lot of talk around, it's not completely related to this, but, minimum guaranteed income, for example. In developed countries, we can take anything from this experiment in that direction. But you want to talk a bit about the experiment and why we are finding these things sort of disappear after some period of time.
Right. So there's sort of like, you can kind of see the echoes of this in the later Liberia study, which I designed 5 or 6 years later. So I was in northern Uganda, which was a politically unstable place for various reasons for many years. I was working in the area most affected by a war, but there was a lot of cattle banditry. There were some refugees from Sudan. The whole broader region was a bit unstable. But when it stabilized around 2005, the government in the much more stable and growing south and central Uganda wanted to plow in resources and just sort of help the north catch back up. And so this was, they had a whole bunch of schemes to do that. And one of them was, the sort of the dirty secret of a lot of foreign aid the last 15, 20 years is governments want to get a lot of money out the door fast. It might be the British government, or it might be the Ugandan government with British money, or a World Bank credit, which was the case with this program. And they don't want to give people cash. And so what they decide, they say, well, we'll start like a community development grant. And the community will get this to, build schools or start businesses or things. And then they just drop $10,000 or $20,000 on that community out of a helicopter practically. And it's basically a cash grant. Sometimes it's to a group, sometimes it's to a village council, sometimes it's to individuals. And so they were doing a lot of experiment, quote unquote experimentation, in the sense of like they were trying out lots of ways of dumping cash in fast and big ways on lots of people, but nobody was really studying it in a rigorous way to sort of say, would this work? And they wouldn't even call it cash transfer programs, partly because it wasn't just a pure cash transfer. They were doing other things. Maybe there was a little training, but they, but also it was like politically, like the whole idea that you would just give some poor person cash. Of course they'd waste it. They'd drink it, they'll waste it. They'll make bad choices. So there's this sort of paternalistic attitude that we just can't give people cash.
Right.
And which was totally plausible. I actually thought it was a terrible program when they asked me to study it. I was like, oh, this is gonna be a disaster. Why would you give these bozos cash? Like it's like some 22-year-old getting, 20 times their annual income, or not 20 times. That's not true. Like one or two times their annual income in one go. It's sort of like when I was 22, if someone had given me like $100,000 or whatever, like 2 times somebody's annual income was in Canada, which is where I was, I would have made short work of that money. So I had a low opinion. But I think that turned out to be wrong. So and that was sort of the start of a lot of experiments I've had, which just have some theme of like giving money to the last people you would ever give money to, where eventually the ultimate, the absolute extreme of that was, of course, going to Liberia and finding mercenaries and street youth and thieves and saying, what happens when you give them cash? And actually they do well. Even those guys are doing fine. So that was a big government program, and they asked me to evaluate it. And so once again, we organized this big randomized control trial where we had several thousand people receiving it and several thousand people not. And then we initially followed them up after 2 and then 4 years. And then the paper you saw is going back after almost 10 years.
Yeah, and it's surprising. You say little effect on mortality, fertility, or family health or education. And so this concept that you can give a capital money and that individual will then use it optimally to improve her situation, I think it's not necessarily true, right?
I think it actually was. Everything in retrospect makes a lot of sense from like basic microeconomics. So if someone was to like find an American kid and give them a huge sum of money, it's not clear to me that person's life would be that much different 20 years later because they just there's nothing. If I need to go to school, I can get a loan. If I want to start a business, I can get a loan. Maybe if it's a young person, like I have a little bit of difficulty, but I don't really face huge barriers unless I come from a really underprivileged background. And then that money might make a big difference. I might actually be able to start something I couldn't otherwise. And in the short run, I would look really different than my peers, but only if I was coming from a place where that money was like solving a problem I had. And that's actually what this was doing in Uganda. It was saying, well, actually, most young people are like that really underprivileged American. Most people have no access to credit. There's no such things as loans. I mean, there's microcredit, but the loans are 3 months long and the interest rate's like 200% a year. Like that is not a vehicle for investment. So for all intents and purposes, people don't have credit. They also can't save. Like if you go to Liberia, Uganda, for every, here we grumble if we only get like a percent would be like a terrific savings rate on and a few percent is a great return on your mutual fund. But your nominal interest rate in a lot of poor countries is like -5 or 10%, meaning you go to the local informal bank and for every $10 you give them, they keep $1. And then inflation's like 15%. So before you know it, your real interest rate is like -15, -20, -25%. So you save cash and it just sort of melts away over time. So you're also savings constrained. So if you want to save up to start a business, you need to, it's really hard. And so giving somebody a cash grant is a way to sort of catapult them forward and let them start something. And that's what people did. You go to poor countries. And I haven't seen evidence from the U.S., but if you went to underprivileged Americans, people who could be entrepreneurs but are credit constrained, can't go to college or can't start a business, they invested. They make good choices on average with that money. They catapult ahead. And that's what we found after 2 and 4 years. And it led to sort of that plus some other results from other people on cash transfers generally led to a lot of exuberance, which I think is partly deserved. But what we found, at least in this one case, and I think people are starting to see elsewhere, to a degree, is to say, well, after long enough time, what would have happened to me if I didn't get that grant? Well, I still had good ideas. I still knew what I wanted to invest in. I couldn't borrow easily. I couldn't save very easily, but I could find ways to save a bit. And so eventually what we saw in Uganda is the people who didn't get the money scrimped and saved and eventually was able to start something of their own. And so they caught up. And which is good. That's great news. That just means, they're in a growing, functioning economy. And so they weren't in a poverty trap. They got pushed. So this cash grant sort of catapulted this generation forward, 5 or 10 years sooner, that's a great return on investment. And it had some positive effects. They've got more savings and they've got, more assets. And so there are some long run effects that are positive that you kind of expect because you got catapulted ahead. But it's disappointing because we didn't transform lives, but it's also hopeful because we sort of said, well, actually people aren't so stagnant. People aren't trapped in this rut.
I wondered, Chris, the giving money is one policy. Microfinancing has had some successes. I don't know the data in places like India and Bangladesh. And so maybe, there is a difference between financing something than, sort of an unconstrained endowment.
Well, so yeah, if you could give somebody a very low interest rate loan, it would have effectively the same effect. And maybe that would be better for society because you get the money back and you could give it to somebody else. And it wouldn't be as costly and or have a big deadweight loss. Somebody has to pay back that loan or grant, or somebody had to pay taxes for that grant. But here's the thing. No, find me a low interest, even medium rate microfinance anywhere in the world. Like I said, usually the interest rate is 5, 10, 20% per month. Because the transaction costs are very high on these. Even the nonprofits, these aren't like money grubbing money lenders, although they are also charging high rates. This is like the NGOs run by well-meaning community leaders. That's just how much it seems to cost to run these loans because of transactions costs. I don't know. I've never studied it in depth. And so as a result, microcredit very seldom is an investment vehicle, and very seldom, there's almost no studies that show microcredit has a effect on poverty. People love it. Like if you give people a borrowing option, even a short-term one, they use it. It's like, so I always say microcredit's like microwaves. Everybody's happier they have one. And if you give me a microwave, I'm going to be happier because it's like I get this consumption value from the microwave. I get this value from having more of a portfolio of borrowing in my life, but it's not going to make me that much better off in material terms.
Okay, so we'll take a quick break, Chris. When we come back, we talk about a different item, that's gangs.
Great.
Okay, talk to you soon.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we are back. Chris, we were talking about some of the experimental randomized trials that you have conducted in different countries, in Liberia and Uganda, specifically looking at therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as cash given to people to reduce the issue of crime and violence, as well as poverty, and it seems to have mixed results. It has clearly tactical benefits, but in the long run, things seem to revert back to the norm. So you have another paper that is going to come out in a week or two entitled Gang Rule, Understanding and Countering Criminal Governance. I find this paper interesting. So you have a quote here: strong states provide order, regulate everyday life, and collect taxes as the sole legitimate user of violence in society. You say when traditional leaders or NGOs provide order, they do not necessarily undermine the government. Far more threatening to state capacity and legitimacy are armed and hostile actors who settle disputes, police, and tax. And so you have some examples here in some countries where gangs actually provide these services that we expect from governments. And presumably, Chris, in some of these cases, they might be more efficient in providing the services.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you find?
Well, yeah, exactly. So this is part of like a bigger, longer term project on gang organization, and it happens. A lot of my work right now happens to be in Colombia, in the city of Medellin.
Yeah.
And it came partly. I went there. I had kids, and then it's very hard to work in Africa when you can't bring your kids to Liberia or northern Uganda. It's totally safe. There's just no hospitals, so I don't really want to bring the kids. And so I started looking for places that were relatively developed but have violence, and I started working in Colombia.
Yeah.
And when I went there with a postdoc that I was working with, who's from Medellin, what not even he really realized, in spite of working on crime, in spite of being from Medellin, in spite of before becoming a PhD student, he was actually in the government, the regional government, working on security issues. And he had no idea that just the number and the depth and the organization of gangs in the city, street gangs called combos.
Yeah.
And not only that they were sort of like drug gangs everywhere, they run the local drug corners, and they run, the loan sharking. That was true in the U.S. as well. But these ones actually seem to govern their neighborhoods to a degree. And what we realized is that this is super common. The Taliban do this. The Colombian guerrilla, the FARC did this. Gangs, they do this in the United States and in the Texas and the California and to some extent the Illinois prison systems. They govern the lives of civilians, where here civilians are the other inmates. It's in Rio, it's in El Salvador. So it's a really common phenomenon for these non-state armed groups to govern. And so the broader project was just, well, let's understand, like, how are these gangs organized? Like, there's just no information, like, on career paths or internal organization or the market structure and profit, margins and things of this nature. What are the economics? But then why would they govern? I was just really curious and just to understand why they ruled. And so this was a paper that grew out of what's now maybe 4 years of a lot of qualitative interviews, a lot of sort of some economic theory, collecting a lot of data, and then eventually running an experiment.
Yeah. And so what are the answers to this question? So why do they govern? Why do they settle disputes? Is it just more like they have a captured market and they want to keep order in that market so they can extract some rents? Or what is underlying?
Right. Well, there's a few motives. So I mean, one of the things is they don't do all sorts of. There's lots of governance, right? So what do we think of as governance? Well, one thing would be infrastructure, right? Well, they don't provide infrastructure. The government provides infrastructure, but they're not providing these big, expensive public goods. And they're not doing like collective decision making and coordination problems. Like, where do we put the garbage? Where do we put the dog poop? Like, how do we solve these sort of collective problems that we have? They're not doing that either. They're actually focused on and this is true of a lot of these armed groups everywhere. They focus on a narrow kind of governance. They focus on protection services. And protection, by that I mean dispute resolution. So you have to evict a tenant, your neighbor's playing the music too loud, somebody owes you money, somebody's harassing your store. Like, there's just sort of like, there's basically dispute resolution. Security and policing, crime reporting, dealing just a lot of street disorder as well. So they're basically selling protection, and protection is a problem. And you can make money from selling private goods. I could sell beer, I could sell cigarettes, I could sell I can sell loans, and I can sell protection. And so it's just a private good that they can sell. And it's certainly helpful if you have a comparative advantage in coercion and basically roughing people up, which they've developed for their other business lines. And so it's sort of a natural thing for them to go into that they can make money from. So there's this sort of just basic, just like any other business, they set a price and the state sets a price and they compete with the state to sell protection. So and we thought it was more limited to that, but then we sort of, a lot of the papers about uncovering how that's actually kind of a minor motive, and how there are these actually other motives that sort of drive their need to govern.
So the mechanics of that, Chris, just for my own understanding. So is the price like tax that everybody is paying the same amount or same percentage or whatever, or is that a transaction price?
Right. So in Medellin, sometimes they call them security fees or surveillance fees. Other times they call them vacuna, which is literally translated means vaccine. And you can kind of, so some of it's fee for service. Like if you have somebody you need to evict, or you have a debt you need to collect, or you have a neighbor with a noise complaint, and I come and you call me and I solve that for you, then I just charge you a fee, sort of like a court fee or just any kind of fee for service. Yeah. But mostly and that fee they'll set, it's totally arbitrary, how much they think you can pay, your relationship with them, it's very informal. Most of what they collect is in the form of these security fees. You can think of it like a weekly subscription.
Yeah.
Payment. And so, I subscribe to Apple Music, but if I have a store and live in Medellin, maybe I subscribe to the combo. And that just means I can call them and they'll take care of problems without maybe charging me fees, and they'll keep their eye on the street. They don't charge everybody. They'll charge if they choose to enter that business line in a neighborhood. They may only provide it on some streets and not others. And they might not charge everybody on the street because, I might be connected to you, or I might be connected to the police, or I might just be refuse to talk to the combo and they just don't, they think it's not worth the bother. So it's maybe 20 or 30 or 40% of businesses might pay. But it's really very.
Is there multiple service providers in the same markets?
So usually we think of it as the way we sort of try to analyze it through the lens of like these old duopolistic models of competition that I learned, in grad school and never looked at again, but have relearned. So typically the state and the combo, the combo has a local monopoly on its drugs, and no other combos operate in its territory. And so the market for protection is mainly between the state and the combo. There are community leaders and there's lots of informal local governance. In any community in the world, there's always big men and women and people who will solve problems for you. So it's never a true duopoly. But for the most part, like the main providers are the state and the combo.
Okay, and so they have sort of territorial monopolies, except for the government, of course. And you mentioned, Chris, that the real incentives are something different than an economic motive.
So it is sort of an economic motive, but it's like an indirect benefit. Economists would call it an externality or spillover from other business lines. So basically, there's several things that are driving it. The big one is just the fact that that providing order helps them make more money at their other businesses. And so, because the state is predating on their drug markets and the state is predating on their loan sharking and so forth, and you need two things. One is you don't want the police to have an excuse to come into the neighborhood, because every time they come around, maybe they'll shake you down or they'll see your drug corner or something. And so you have an incentive to provide order just so that the police don't have an excuse to come around. But you also want civilian loyalties. In the insurgency literature, they call this hearts and minds, but we just sort of think of it more as a loyalty, which is to say that when, the cops come around, you want one gang leader told us, you want the civilians to hide you, and you want them not to tell the cops where you are, and you want them not to give the cops any information. And if you take care of business and you keep them happy, then they'll tolerate you and they'll support you, and they might even hide you from the police, and they certainly won't collaborate. And so basically there's this sort of externality on this other business where you can kind of think of the state and the gang are in a contest to control this drug market. One wants to get rid of it. One wants to exploit it and charge monopoly prices. And so provide this governance, they provide because it has this positive spillover, which helps explain why a lot of gangs provide the services without even charging much of vacuna. And it also helps explain why they wouldn't necessarily charge everybody or make such big investments to charge so many people. It's because they don't want to, they want to have enough to sort of make it worth their while, sort of maybe meet their costs, but they also charge a fee because they don't want to be overconsumed. Like, it was free, everybody would get them to govern everything. So it's sort of a way to ration their service. But a lot of them tell us they're mainly doing it for this, to sort of help this other market.
Yeah. Did you get some insights into how they're structured? Is it like a mafia structure, or it's an LLC with members, or how the profits divvied up? Yeah.
So that's another paper which we hope to have out later this year, where we're collecting data. We've been developing. We've got contacts in about 40 of these organizations. Usually, we've met at least one leader or middle-ranking member. Yeah. And we're collecting this kind of information. So they are, I wouldn't call them like autocratic organizations entirely. Like they definitely have a leadership structure. The guys at the top are the bosses. But, who are you to control this neighborhood? We're all 15 of us or all 25 of us in this combo are are from the same neighborhood, and you're smarter and you're more talented and you worked your way up to the top, so you're the coordinator, which is what they call the leader. But you know, we all have some legitimacy, and so I think that constrains the extent to which this one person makes all the decisions and monopolizes the profit. So there is a certain amount of cooperative decision making and a lot of profit sharing. So the coordinator gets, you know, a lot of money. You know, the coordinators are some of the best paid people in the city. But you know, the 21-year-old or the 18-year-old who's running the drug corner, or who's just even some cog in the drug corner, is also getting paid really well, much more than the marginal cost. Much more than you know what their outside option is available. And I think it's partly because they can make this. Partly it's a moral claim, but partly it's also just a coup threat. Like, you know, I've got to share the rents. Not equally, but not too unequally in the organization to avoid an uprising.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's more like a company, like an LLC with managing partners and so on. Maybe they have different equity stakes in the organization, but it sounds to me that it's more like a market organization rather than a mafia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not so sure. I don't know about the. I guess I hope to know what you think about when you're saying like a mafia organization, because I'm not sure that street gangs or mafias are that much differently organized in the United States. Sicily, I know a little bit, but I actually don't know this aspect of their organization.
Oh, maybe this is my bias. You know, when I think about a mafia, I think of this autocratic. You know, the top guy can do pretty much anything.
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, so here's the thing, like in a firm, it's I think they tend to be, and I can't speak for sure to the Sicilian American mafia because I just know a little bit. But if I like run a company, there's a set of well-defined property rights that sort of make me the boss, right? The shareholders own the company. They have all the voting rights. They make me the CEO. And then like an employee has just almost to say they can threaten to leave or they can organize and strike, and that gives them some bargaining power. But at the end of the day, the kid who's like the most junior person in a partnership or who's in some company has no say whatsoever. But there's nobody enforcing your coordinatorship. There's no laws or external body of rules to sort of support your leadership of this organization. You only lead because everybody consents to let you lead. And so there is a sort of revolution constraint that sort of binds you. You have to keep everybody happy. And this is true of any mob organization. And so you piss people off too much or you don't listen to them and they'll knock you out.
Right. Yeah. So there is a sort of a risk sharing happening, right? So anybody can basically sell you out if they're pissed off.
Yeah. So the way they build property rights over these organizations, and I think this is probably true in the U.S. and Sicily as well, is you can kind of collude as a set of leaders to sort of decide that we're going to support one another and we're not going to support, say, rebellions. And so if you could say, so if I'm like a junior member of a group and I like kill my leader and I try to take power in a coup, then it could be that all the other armed groups, you know, have made commitments in some way to like exclude me or to make that unattractive. And that's a way of providing some property rights for the leaders and some security and then letting the leaders get richer at the sort of the general member's expense. And that happens to a degree. There's an element of that. There's like a big hierarchy of crime. There's a lot of groups. There's a lot of collusion in Medellin as well. But still, you have a lot of bargaining power as a junior or middle-ranking member.
Yeah, this is not a bad thing for the state, right? So do we have examples where, you know, the state basically decided this is how they're going to govern? In other words, you know, that they're going to have 18 GAP that are given sort of local monopoly to manage those spaces, and the state itself step in only if there is an issue that they cannot really solve.
Well, you know, so in a very short run sense, so it's certainly true that if you're a mayor and you come in, it does not make a lot of sense to like mess with this system because you have a term limit of 1 term. And so you're going to be out in 4 years. And if you take on these gangs, there's just going to be a lot of violence and a lot of people are going to get killed and it's going to be a big hassle. But long run, this is not a good system for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, there's no rule of law here in their governing. Like, it's sort of like, the gang solves the dispute of the person who pays the most or who's the best connected to them. So it's not the kind of egalitarian governance that we want. In addition, it's like, it is threatening, these guys, this is not exactly like people's ideal. So nobody can imagine a life otherwise. Nobody would want the gang to leave tomorrow, but everyone seems to like a world where there'd be no gangs in 20 or 30 years. They just don't know how to get there. Likewise, maybe the big problem is just the fact is 400, or actually there's about 380 combos in the metropolitan area. There's about 17 higher level mafia-like organizations called razones above them. So there's almost 400 organizations. And about every decade or two, they've gone to war with one another. They maintain a fragile peace. They do collude. It's not in their interests to fight because they don't like dying. It interferes with their business. But it's a fragile equilibrium. And so every 10 or 20 years, there's been a big war. And in those moments, Medellin becomes the most violent place on the planet, literally, by a large margin. And that's bad for everybody. That's especially bad if you're a gang member because your mortality rate is really high. So it's not so long run. It's not really a peaceful equilibrium for a city to have this, and so they'd like to get rid of it. They don't really know how, and that was partly what the paper was about. And one of the things we discovered through an experiment, but also by doing some quasi-experimental analysis of like a really long run effort to increase state presence, is that we found that actually because they have this other, like normally if this was just a market, if it was just that plain I sell protection, the state sells protection. If the state sort of decided for its own reasons that it wanted to crowd the gangs out, they could just provide more. If this was a normal market, if they were just like selling, whatever, loans or something, they could just crowd the gang out by providing more. And that was kind of the philosophy that a lot of people had. And I think the main thing we found from this paper is actually once they have this other motive, it's not so clear. It's actually going to hinder your crowding out. And if their other motive is strong enough, the more you push, the more they're going to push back. And actually what we find a lot of evidence to suggest that if the state tries to crowd the gangs out by governing better and governing more, then at the very least that has no effect on the combo's incentive to rule. And if anything, it pushes in the opposite direction. So over a 30-year horizon, in some neighborhoods, when the state got 20% better at governing, so did the combo. And so there was no change in relative state governance. So once they're established and they have these incentives, it can be really hard to crowd them out in this conventional way.
Yeah, I mean, from a consumer's perspective, they could provide free services. They could provide a higher level of service, perhaps, compared to the state. So they can always differentiate, I would imagine. Do we have any insights into coming back closer to home, to Chicago? Do we have any insights? Chicago also suffers from, not to this extent, but gang-related issues. Is there anything that we can say in that market?
Yeah, so I've been interested in reading more about what has worked or what people think. So there isn't really a systematic body of knowledge where people have collected how to get out of this. Actually, there's some, but it's surprisingly fragmented. What Chicago did was sort of adopt a strategy of cut off the head. So they had these it was very similar. They had they had these mafia-like organizations that were the super gangs, like the Black Pistones and the Gangster Disciples and the Vice Lords are three of the there's several, but three of the sort of super organizations that encompassed all the street gangs, which are more like the combos. And there are hundreds of these street gangs, which were sort of organized themselves under these umbrellas. So it's very much like it's organized in Medellin. They didn't govern the civilians so much, so they may not have had those incentives. And what the government took the same strategy they took with the mob, which was to basically just cut off the heads. And that the problem is that at the end of the day, the mob's fundamental business lines were kind of fading. Like the mob made money from lotteries, and the mob made money from, like, they ran numbers games and loan sharking, they bootlegging, a few other things. They ran the like labor rackets. All of those are in decline by the 1970s or 80s. A lot of their business lines had their heyday 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago or longer. And so when you knocked out the heads, it wasn't like there was a fundamental market reason for the mob to be there. And so that worked pretty well. They just put everybody in jail, made it very difficult for they basically changed the laws to put people away for a long time, make it easier to arrest them. And that really weakened the mob. The problem with applying that to street gangs, in my view, this is just me making stuff up, but my view, the problem this didn't really work for street gangs is because their main market is retail drugs. And there's still a market for retail drugs. You cut off the head, people still want to buy marijuana. You cut off the head, people still want to buy Coke or whatever, whatever now it's pills, whatever they're buying. And so there's a huge market there. So there's always a reason for some organization to exist. But if you cut off the heads for 20 years, then what you've got is a bunch of 16-year-olds with guns with no leadership. And everybody's afraid to stick their head up and organize these guys because they're not that organized and they're kind of violent. And because if they stick up their head and try to organize them, then they get their head cut off. And so what you end up having is a large number of really disorganized, they don't even call them gangs. Like the old guys that I know here in Chicago who used to run some of these gangs, because I've now got a big project in Chicago. With the thing we were doing in Liberia with the CBT, we're actually running in Chicago right now with these high-risk guys. But you talk to the old gang leaders, and they're like, these guys aren't gangs. Like when we were young, we had organization, we had hierarchy. We listened to the old guys. This is just their mobs and cliques. And that's what they call them, mobs and cliques. And it's just a group, you live on a block, and it's a group of a few, 18-year-olds, and you sell, and you defend your territory, and you've got some stupid dispute with the guy 2 blocks over, and you keep shooting, and you're in the cycle of violence, this feud, and it's a mess, and there's nobody to organize it. Yeah. And so that's the consequence, potentially, of this cutting off the head strategy.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Chris, from a policy perspective, so these are all sort of symptoms, right? So we see this in a lot of different countries, developing countries, underdeveloped areas, crime, violence, poverty, gang-related issues. What would be, you have done a lot of work in this area. So from a policy perspective, what would be sort of the 1, 2, 3 things that you'll focus on to sort of clean up, so to speak, an area?
Well, so I think there's not a whole lot you can do if there's a fundamental market that these organizations are serving. You can try to stifle them or make them more disorganized. You can lock them up, but then you get the sort of the Chicago situation, which is, there's just a lot of disorganized violence, but at least there's no real organized crime anymore. And so maybe that's an improvement. I don't think you can take that strategy unless you do what they did with the mob, which is at the same time that you're cracking down on the mob, or shortly before you crack down on the mob, you undermine their businesses. You run a bunch of state lotteries. So you go from, you no longer let them be the monopolist for the numbers racket, or you get rid of prohibition and you allow the legal sale of alcohol, and you provide consumer credit. You invent the credit card. Right. And so these are things that sort of undermine the basic reason for these businesses to exist. And you weaken labor unions, whether that's intentional or not. But that was just a set of economic changes that happened. And so the labor rackets go down. So if you eliminate their economic reason to be, and then you crack down hard, and then they'll go away. I think that's like an oversimplistic story for the mob in the United States. It's one I find plausible. So in Medellin or Chicago, if you're going to keep drugs illegal and crack down on leaders, then the problem's not going to totally go away. So, but legalizing drugs is hard, and it's problematic for its own reasons. At the very least, I think legalizing marijuana is probably a step in the right direction. In Medellin, they could get rid of a lot of the business lines by just consumer credit, having that same revolution. It'll come eventually. yeah, but the hard part is, what do you do with the pills and the hard drugs? And there's a fundamental market that they're serving. There's consumer demand, and this is like the fundamental problem. I don't know the solution to that. It might be that legalization is the best of a set of bad options, but I don't know enough to say that.
Yeah, because so conceptually what you're saying, Chris, is you have to disrupt the markets. You have to disrupt their incentives in some fashion to take care of it, right? So going
there's
back
so much money to be made.
Sort of yeah. So small systems like Liberia, for example, I wondered, the network effects that exist. At least from, I'm just hypothesizing that unless you can lift all 4 million in Liberia, as an example, above the poverty threshold, any local impact, you will see some local benefits for a period of time, but it's going to get, just like you're finding in the data, that it's going to get back to where it started. And so you need some sort of a systemic uplift for the entire country.
That's contrary to like what a lot of criminologists argue, and I'm sympathetic to that. So my friend Thomas Apt has a great book. He was at Harvard. He's now left for a think tank whose name escapes me. He's got a book called Bleeding Out, which is mostly about how to tackle violence in the United States. But the same principles could apply anywhere, including Liberia. And this is actually to say that actually the people who are violent is usually, if we're talking about violence, if we're talking about like poverty, like, yeah, that's a big problem. But if we're just talking about violent people, that's a really small group of people, right? In Liberia, it was a few thousand people. 4 million, most people are not shooting in Liberia right now, at least not, when the war was on, that was one thing. It's a few thousand people who are really at high risk of causing violence. In Chicago, this year, maybe 3,000 people will pull a trigger. All right. And maybe a few thousand more are at risk of pulling a trigger. That's like a manageable number, right? So the trick is actually, it would be nice if you could make them all rich, but that's not going to happen soon. And that would be a really expensive and indirect way to solve violence. So, the trick is to figure out who those few thousand people are and how do you change their incentives and opportunities. And you can do that by arresting them and cracking down, which is one strategy, and you can do that by giving them, recognizing that this is not they don't actually want to pull triggers a lot of the time. Some of them do, but most of them, this is like the guys in Liberia or half the guys that we're working with in Chicago do not want this life, and they would like a better life. And so I think some combination of therapy and jobs would actually would be a really important thing to do systematically. But again, we don't have to do it for millions of people. We just have to figure out the few thousand people and give it to them. And that solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, I keep wondering, Chris, the COVID-19 here, a lot of countries talk about herd immunity for themselves, but there is no herd immunity for a local area or a country. Analogously, I would say, even if those numbers are small, if you're missing 10, 15, 20% of them, I wonder vaccinating 80% actually get you to a stable position in the long run. I just wonder.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I think it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about relatively disorganized groups killing one another, which is what you had in Liberia and what you have to some degree in Chicago. Here in Chicago, it's because they were systematically de-leaderized, whatever the word is. And in Liberia, it's because they were never organized really to begin with. So I think it's pretty straightforward. Like most of these people, they don't really have a strong incentive to lead this life. And so I think you take one person out and you might even have a more than proportional benefit rather than a less than proportional benefit, because they're not starting these cycles of violence and these feuds that characterize a lot of this kind of behavior, especially among young men.
Right.
So I think that's actually quite hopeful that you can have marginal effects that are quite large.
Yeah. So scale is needed. So you could argue completely against what I was saying, which is you could get to herd immunity at 80% because other 20% won't have a viable strategy to really
Or they
perpetuate what
might,
they
but
were
at least
doing.
you've taken care of 80% of the homicide. Big deal, right? Like that's a victory. Like taking care of 10% of the homicides is like a huge victory. So, like take Liberia the program in Liberia costs $500. We could make it a lot better for say $1,000. And let's say there's 3,000 guys in the country who are really problematic. That's cheap. We're not talking a few $1,000,000. Now finding them is hard, but we've been able to do it. They're actually not that hard. People know in their community who the guy, like people know who the dangerous guy is. Like everybody's got an interest in knowing who the problem guy is. And they usually do not mind if you like help them turn their life around. Some people will be like, I can't believe you gave him $1,000 program. Why did they get it? Not me. Most people are like, thank God you dealt with that guy because that guy made me so freaky. And including members of his own gang. Like most gang members don't pull a trigger. Most people don't like to shoot. And the guy who's shooting for the gang, sometimes it's useful for the gang, but sometimes the people are just like, oh man, like he's just really screwing this up for all of us. Like we all feel insecure because so-and-so is like starting this feud with the gang next door. So there's an element of that. Most people don't like to live lives of violence and insecurity, including people in gangs. And so anyways, it's just to say, it's not that hard. But in Liberia, a few $1,000,000 a year would go a long way towards making the country like getting rid of a lot of the killings and there's not much homicide. A lot of it's like armed robbery, some home invasions. It's actually crime levels are very low compared to say some American cities. I think it's a lot more expensive in the United States because it's about 50 times more expensive because people make like 50 times as much. So like the program we're running here, I think is probably for identifying these really high risk guys and delivering like 1.5 years of CBT and services. And it's like $35,000, which is not cheap, but it's cheaper than the homicide.
So you would say these are solvable problems with very little investment. And it could be something that I don't know if foundations really look at this, as a solvable problem. Most often they look at poverty as sort of a disease that's affecting a very large population. But wouldn't you say that in small systems like this, with very little investment, you could completely?
Well, I wouldn't say completely. I mean, let's wait to see. I mean, the effects of this did wear off after 1.5 years or so. Maybe probably. Like we'll find out with the 10-year study. And the early results from our Chicago stuff is that this is not like a magic solution. Like I think it helps a lot of people. Like I guess the thing I would say there's a high social return on in investment, at least for a couple years on these investments. Such that like if you could spend $35,000 a year on 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 men in Chicago, and if that just eliminates 20 homicides, which I think it does, that's kind of what we're seeing, but we'll see. It's early in the study. That's cheaper than prison. That's cheaper than anything else we do in criminal justice in the United States. So it's a high social return investment relative to our other solutions. You're never going to solve the problem completely. You can just I think you can make good progress. The problem is that actually in Chicago, people are really willing to put money behind this. Private foundations have been amazing. They're really far thinking and thoughtful. It's not been my general experience. Most foundations and governments and programs don't think, you know what I'd really like to spend most of my budget on this year? The street thugs. Those are the guys. I'm going to really be able to sell that to my boss. And you know what? I'm going to, because my boss, your boss is like, would rather you go and find some village to poor women or children or, like photogenic or people who feel like they deserve it, right? These guys aren't deserving in anybody's imagination, and they're not. But I mean, well, in some ways they are. They're victims as well in a lot of cases. But they don't evoke sympathy. And so you have to And then you just have to do it every year for like the next crop of violent 20-year-old.
Right.
And the year after that. And,
right.
And when you're running the program, you know, you have to deal with the fact that some of these guys will keep killing. And you're like, okay, what do I do? Just think of yourself as an NGO. I'm running a program. I have these guys, like killers and whatnot, in my program because they're the most dangerous people. And then they do something really bad on site. They don't kill anybody, but they beat up someone who works for the program. Do I kick them out of the program? And on the one hand, of course, it's partly even consistent with CBT, like there has to be consequences, but also I can't like give up on these guys, because if I kick him out, he's just going to kill somebody instead of just beating them up. And so that makes sense. But if you're running this program and these guys are like beating up somebody every 6 months in your program, like, what do you do with that? It's hard. It's really hard to work with this population.
This has been great, Chris. Thanks so much for spending time with me. Yeah, good luck with this research.
Thanks.
It's really important.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.